I'm very happy to introduce the moderator of this first session for today, William Swislow, who, of course, we heard from yesterday if we were here, but for those of you who weren't with us, I'm just going to introduce him once again. William Swislow, a founder and longtime executive at Cars.com, is now a digital media consultant, writer, art collector, and a lecturer at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. He operates a cultural website, interestingideas.com, and sits on the board of Intuit and Spaces Archive, and I know we had someone from Spaces here with us yesterday. Spaces is dedicated to documenting and promoting art environments, and the Daily Cardinal Alumni Association. Swislow has written about art for a variety of publications, including the Chicago Tribune, Raw Vision, Intuit's The Outsider, and the Journal of the Society for Commercial Archaeology, He has curated exhibits focused on art made from bottle caps, on popular crafts, on metalworker Stanley Schwark, and most recently on work by lesser-known and anonymous artists, mostly from Chicago, in the Chicago We Own It exhibition currently on view at Intuit. Without further ado, William Swislow, who will introduce the rest of our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you very much. Oh, yeah, there was a lot of concern about that yesterday.
We moved it against the stage because yesterday we were afraid someone was going to fall off.
Yes, people were very worried yesterday about panelists tipping backwards. Yes, thank you. Well, we'll have to be careful. Anyways, we've already heard a fair amount about collectors, and today we're going to hear from some collectors who have generously agreed to give us virtual tours of their virtual house tours of their collections. Of course, no one is as important as the artists in terms of the world we live in, but collectors obviously play an important role, especially with the artists that we're interested in here, that much of the work we see would have disappeared were it not for collectors who are interested in it. And many of the creators, at least a fair number of the creators of this work, may have never known they were artists unless a collector had told them they were artists, an experience many of us have had. So the format is going to be each person on the panel is going to sort of take us through their collection and talk a little bit about what they've collected and how and why. But let me introduce the panelists from that direction to this direction. So Cleo Wilson, who is a founder of Intuit. She was our president in 2002. You may want to make notes on this so you remember, 2000 to 2002, and again in 2013 to 2017, and was our executive director from 2005 to 2012. So has probably given more of herself to Intuit, other than maybe Jan, who's on my other side, and Suzanne. The three of them are have done so much. Of course, in her other life, Cleo worked at Playboy Enterprises from 1976 to 2005. She was executive director of the foundation from 1984. And I guess I didn't know all of your titles at Playboy. You were named director of public affairs in 1989 and appointed vice president in 2000 and then retired in 2005. So this has been educational for me. Mike Noland, next, is, as many of you know, is an artist, curator, writer, folk art collector, and teacher. And as some of you may not know, Mike helped curate Intuit's very first show, along with Aaron Packer, who is here too, working with Clay Morrison in 1991 from Chicago, which I think was only up for a few days, if I understand it, Navy Pier. But obviously an important event for Intuit. Mike started collecting what I guess you call folk art, so that's your term of art?
That's fine, I don't.
Yeah, I know. In 1980. He graduated with an MFA from Ohio State University in 1982, and of course, with that Ohio connection, he had friendships with Elijah Pierce, Popeye Reed, and William Hawkins, and has obviously been as many of you know, a passionate advocate for these artists. And, since then moved to Chicago in 1984, very expert in collecting and curating American folk art. He has a truly exceptional collection, as you'll see, and he's curated shows for the Cultural Center in Intuit. The Intuit shows include also, besides from Chicago, the only survey of folk art stone carving we've done, which was in 2003. And he's also a writer who's contributed to various catalogs, to Antiques and Fine Art magazine over the years. Then Jan Petry, who, again, this is all very educational. So, arrived in Chicago in 1962 as a graduate student at the Institute of Design at IIT. I knew she had a career in graphic design and advertising, 25 years at Leo Burnett as a VP Associate Creative Director. She was already collecting, according to the biography, objects, calipers, advertising tins, and signs, and then was drawn into folk art. And that 1982 Corcoran show, Black Folk Art in America, I think had a major transformational effect on how she collected, and led to her involvement with Intuit, where for 25 years she was exhibits chair. Of course, she is now president of our board and is also a sculptor. And important to say, Jan is very proud, and as are all of us, of the years and years and dozens of quality exhibits that Intuit has had under her direction. And then finally, Patric McCoy, who recently retired from 28-year career as an environmental scientist at the EPA. So thank you for helping clean up our air. That's actually a great government success story, right? I mean, for those of us who've been around a while, we know how different life is today in terms of air quality. BA in chemistry from the University of Chicago, and a master's in environmental science from Governor State University, which is near where I grew up. He's been collecting contemporary African-American art for 46 years, has a collection of more than 1,300 pieces of fine art, 90% of it by Chicago artists. In 2003, he co-founded Diasporal Rhythms, where he is president, and it's a interesting not-for-profit of art collectors, informed and passionate art collectors from Chicago's African-American communities. And the organization and Patric himself promote the collection of artworks by living artists of African descent by sponsoring exhibitions, seminars, studio visits, home tours, and I think speech-making and public appearances that are showcasing the art being collected in African-American communities. So that's our esteemed panel. And now I'm going to turn it over to Cleo to start and sort of take us through a little view of her collection and some perspective on it. So you're up.
It's really going to be a little view because I was the only one that stuck to the instructions to to do 5 slides, and so I probably had 25, and I honed it down to 5. So I don't know what it's going to end up looking like, but what do I point to? Oh, okay, and then what?
Hold on. If you just hit the arrows either way.
Okay. So I started collecting fish, of all things, and mostly it was Mexican fish, and I don't even really know where or when I first saw them, but I loved how they looked. And so I had lots of these fish all over the place, and particularly over the windows in my front room. And at one point, I got up there to dust and clean, and it turned out that they had some kind of bugs inside. So the whole outside of the fish was still there, but when you picked it up, it was all just sawdust that crumbled out. So it sort of changed the type of fish that I was collecting. So somebody had told me that you need to put them in the freezer to kill the bugs before you display them. So I did that, but I started getting fish that weren't from Mexico. So the other part of my collection, which I used to just call Mammy-bulia, was I collected Black folk art. And a lot of it was an attempt, I think, if I saw something that was really, I thought, ugly, I didn't want anybody else to have it. I didn't know where these things were going to go. So I thought, I have to have them. I have to take them off the market. And so I don't even have all of them showing, but I have also doorstops, dolls, all kinds of African art. Well, what would you call it? It wasn't folk art at the time. A lot of it was practical. For instance, the two things next to the wooden part are pot holders, and they're all embroidered and very nice, but they are slimy from use, but they were pot holders. The three things on the bottom were just for putting your grocery list or what have you, and I guess I didn't include the slide that has paper towels, holders, but most of it was pretty bad, but it needed to be off the market, so it came to my home. And this is where my beginnings started. Jan, in 1984, when the Black folk art exhibit came to Chicago. Unfortunately, that exhibit couldn't even get into a museum, and it was at the Chicago Museum of Natural History. It was at the Field Museum. And I went in there, and I can still remember like it happened last week, that when I first walked in, on the left side of the gallery was this giant painting, and it had a sort of a turquoise blue background, and there was a guy painted on there holding a conch shell to his ear, and it said Dr. Buzz. And I could see the Coca-Cola race behind it, so that it was clear that this had been painted on a Coca-Cola the Coca-Cola ad. And I looked at that, and I walked in a little more, and I was like, what the hell is this? So, but I came back out, and I read the didactic that was on the outside of the gallery, and I went on and went in. That was where I saw James Hampton's throne, and Nellie Mae Rowe with that's a chewing gum sculpture. She didn't have clay. She used old chewing gum, and then she painted it. I think it might have been a little more erect earlier. But, in heat and stuff, it just started to lean over. So I actually have 3 of those. But that was what started it all for me. Afterwards, I came out of there and I went back again. So I saw this show twice. And I wasn't really sure why I hadn't known about this stuff before. So it was back in '84, we had telephone books, and I was trying to find where I could find this material. And somehow or another, I came up with the Terra Museum. And at that time, it was in Evanston, but they had folk art in their name. So I got on the L, and I went to Evanston to go see the stuff. And it wasn't what they had at all. It was totally different, and what I described as big head babies and square cows. It's just nothing like what I had seen. So it was a year later that fate would have it that I met my partner, Bob Roth, and he had seen the same show. That we were looking for what we had in common, and that was it, that we had seen the same show. And he knew about that art, and he introduced me to Carl Hammer and Ann Nathan and a lot of the people around here today, and that was my real introduction. So when I started my collection, I tried to focus on black artists. At the beginning was going to be just women. So it was going to be just black self-taught women. And then you see Charles Smith snuck in there on the left, right. And then it's mixed in with some African Igbo mask as well. And that's all Nellie Mae Real, actually. And then I think those those statues are Carl McKenzie, and he's a Kentucky carver, and supposedly he only made 6 figures that were black. I have 3 of them, and I think somebody told him that it was racist for him to make them, so he stopped making them. And then other things sort of slowly crept in. So here's a white guy up there, Michel Nejar, who's actually Moroccan, but I thought his work, it just speaks to me, the face with the 2 eyes, and to me, I think it really fits in somehow for me. And then on the bottom, I really fell off the wagon. That's a Lucy Slavinsky, but it reminded me a lot of the bottle. God damn it! No, not a bottle tree. The African fetishes and Nkizis. I have seen an African Nkizi that was all bottles, with a head on it. Patrick probably knows what I'm talking about. But this reminded me of that, and one day I hope to put it beside it. So let's see. So that basically this. I think I've almost done with my 5 slides. So the 2 major pieces. My major piece, the first really big piece of art that I bought was a Mr. Imagination totem pole, and I don't have a picture of it, but it's at Intuit, so you can go and see it. It's a beautiful totem pole. He made it in 1993, and it's called Women of Somalia. It was when Somalia was much in the news, and he made locks with beautiful dreadlocks with stringing bottle caps on hanger wire. But that was the first major piece that I bought. It was $5,000. And I had brought little paintbrushes before that, his paintbrushes. I had 3 paintbrushes. But, and even when I bought the totem pole, it was on easy time payment. So over the couch, I just did a detail. That's Nellie Mae Real. I think it's called Picking Cherries. She was also in the Corcoran show. And this is the best piece ever. This is Minnie Evans, that if you can make it out on the bottom, she started that piece in 1946, and she ended it in 1967. And this was a gift from my partner. I wouldn't have been able to afford this piece. But the thing that I really like about this, and that I like to talk about with Minnie Evans, is when she discovered that art was on canvas, she took all of her drawings that were on paper and cut them out and collaged them onto a canvas. So that's, so the years are all the different pieces that she's glued onto this canvas. And then you can see that she painted around the canvas so that it becomes one whole piece. So in sum, I would say that race still drives my collecting. And of course, it's my interest. And I truly believe that a lot of these artists would not be seen, or we wouldn't know about them if it wasn't for this genre. So if it's not, they wouldn't make it into the academia. So when people say that the field is going out, or the people are being co-opted into the mainstream museums, I don't think that's true at all. There are a few, but if you think about it, and I might be wrong, but I don't think one woman is named in the 5 or 6 that have made it across. There's not one African American woman that's made it to the so-called mainstream. So there's still a lot to be done, and there's still a role for Intuit and a role for all of us collectors. Thanks.
Stay there.
Yeah, I think I'll stay here. I think you can see it.
Well, you can sit down there.
Oh, you just turned it off the other way. Oh, here. There you go.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi. So just the center.
The right one.
That's me. I'm going to try and do this way. So this gives you an idea of where I started. I was, of course, working in design and advertising, and my early collecting sort of reflected that interest. The tins, advertising tins, signs, calipers and dividers, which were tools of the trade, painted tin types, that sort of thing. Hanging around flea markets, antique shows. And I became, somehow found out about the Maine Antique Digest, and that led me to some folk art collecting. This is a sort of view of my current apartment. Oh, they're all ganged together okay. You can see some of the folk art mixed in with what we're now calling outsider art. My early collecting included small carved pieces. The first piece I bought, I ran into Carl Hammer at an art show a few months prior to him opening his gallery. At about the same time, the Corcoran show, I read about the Corcoran show in Time magazine. So I went to Louisville, and I did have the pleasure of seeing the show there, which was actually more complete than what was brought to Chicago to the Field Museum. But Carl opened his gallery a few months later on Michigan Avenue. It was a short walk at lunchtime from Leo Burnett. So I sort of got my education there and was quite fortunate to be able to get in on some of the early exhibitions there. This sort of shows my evolution. That's kind of a portrait wall with folk art, anonymous folk art portraits, actually purchased in Maine, and some of the whirligigs, small carvings down below, progressing to S.L. Jones. Then I think my first piece of what I later found out was maybe outsider art was the Howard Finster. I went in, found Phyllis Kine Gallery one day at lunchtime also. And I remember, at the time, I was just buying things like that because they spoke to me, which is why I buy anything, personally. And then the Dwight McIntosh drawing on the end. So it's sort of a wall of evolution there from the early folk art, anonymous portraits, to the art from workshops. One of the first things also, on a trip to shoot in California, I've found I wandered into a gallery and saw a whole exhibition of possum trot figures. The small head was part of the environment at Possum Trot. And so that was the beginning, and now the other slide at the end, 2 artists from Googing. So I'm interested, I think probably for me, the future of true art out of the mainstream comes out of these workshops. Early collecting, as I said, thank goodness Carl Hammer started showing trailer in 1981 or 82, 83, whenever. So I was fortunate to obtain those paintings. Right. Carl had Charles Shannon, and they showed this collection immediately right after the Corcoran show. So we were quite honored in Chicago to be seeing that work. One of the first pieces I remember getting from Phyllis Kine was the Ramirez. I'm particularly like the small William Hawkins. It's kind of odd to have a very small William Hawkins, but it speaks to me in particular because it's Wrigley Field. And then one of my favorite unknown outsider artists, not known to that many, but hangs over my bed, the drawing by Genevieve Seal in the bottom right. Very detailed calligraphic imagery. Bill said, what did you find that was maybe most important? And I think the thing that, if I have any legacy as far as discovery, would be these chairs by Hosea Hayden. It was the first exhibit that I curated at Intuit, eccentric chairs. Hosea Hayden was a farmer in Indiana, and he made these small folding tripod chairs for his neighbors. They are totally scrimshawed in the sense that they're etched with imagery basically as his journals. And this was in the late 1890s. He was speaking about women's rights. One chair is totally on suffrage. Another bottom of the chair says America's Game, and it shows a group of, that's the bottom of the chair on the left, in fact, a group of people playing baseball. I did some research and found out, and they're in stocking feet that has red ink into the etching. The first baseball team, national team, was the Cincinnati Red Stockings, which was about 40 miles from his farm. So I'm sure that's who that was. Other chairs talk about child abuse. They talk about people out of the ordinary. They talk about patriotism. I mean, I think they're amazing works. They belong in a major place, and right now a group of them is at the Smithsonian. They've been rotating them through the last 3 or 4 years. We've been switching them in and out. Just sort of one, but we had the show. It took a while. I think my time is up, but
just briefly, how did you find it?
Okay, well, when we were doing the chair, I just happened to see one at an antique show in, actually the staff. I was on my way home. I live in Richmond, I'm from Richmond, Indiana, and I saw this chair, and the dealer told me that he thought that the guy was from Liberty, Indiana. And that's about 6 miles from where I grew up. So I was home for the weekend. I went on home. I didn't think that much more about it. We were home. My mother says, "What do you want to do?" I said, "What is there to do?" She said, "There's a street fair in Liberty, Indiana." And I said, "Okay." So I went to the street fair, and I think the dealer also told me that they were there was one in a historical society. Well, in Liberty, Indiana, the historical society was the basement hallway of the courthouse. So I've asked around, I got there, and they had a chair. And I ran into a elderly woman, probably my age now. She was she wasn't too forthcoming. We tried to find out some information about the chairs. I learned that there probably were several others owned by people in the town. These chairs have been given as gifts to neighbors. So I sort of made friends with her. Just serendipitously, I was curating the Eccentric Chairs show. So I asked her if I gave her a letter to give to the owners, would she, to see if they would meet with me at Thanksgiving, would she do that? And she said she would, anonymously. So I gave her the letter. I went back at Thanksgiving and had 6 or 8 people there and made the proposal about showing the chairs in Chicago. And that's when Intuit we were borrowing galleries. We were actually the people doing the first pop-up galleries, I think. So we had a space that we borrowed, actually a lovely gallery over Kiki's Bistro. So we had, I think in the end, I had 10 chairs in that show. And,
Okay, well, no,
That's it.
Great. That's great. So Patrick, you're on next. Thank you, Jen.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm going to, oops. Okay. All right, I'm going to be talking about how I ended up in this place. Because I'm an art collector, but not necessarily have been focused on what is identified as outsider art or Intuit art or naive or brute or whatever. I am an art collector, and I'm very passionate about it. In fact, to the point, as they just said, that even though I was trained and worked as an environmental scientist, I have always had a passion for art and have always gone around and involved myself in going to see shows and so forth, art shows, and always have, since college, have been acquiring art. To the point that in 2003, I formed an organization to promote art collecting because I found it to be a really serious problem, and I think it's the same problem even within this community, is that there's a concept of this elitism in the visual arts culture of America, and that elitism basically keeps most people from considering themselves an art collector and tends to marginalize such a large percentage of the art makers. And so I became very upset about that because it took me a while to get to a point where I saw myself as an art collector. And then once I saw it, I recognized that I have to act. And so I think what we've, in my community, are different is that we've taken the position of the art collector now as an active agent, not as just a passive participant within the visual arts culture, but someone that actually is pushing the thing. In fact, I often see articles written about art in all different forms, and they'll list all of the different people, the curators, the archivists, the art makers, the gallerists, and so forth. And almost invariably, you will not see in that list art collectors. And I'm like, that's crazy. If we don't have an art collector, then there's no art field. All right, so this is what we are concerned about, is to change this mindset of this very elitist, gilded, small community of people that are actually art collectors, and we want to change it to a big, big tent of all kinds of people can be a participant in the visual arts community. All right. Like I said, it's been a journey. And I had to go through a lot of unlearning in order to get to the point where I am an active art collector. And I found that so many other people have had the same problem. And then what you end up with is that the act is very, very simple. And all these other people have said the same thing. You basically are just getting what you like. You see something, you like it, and you get it. And that makes you an art collector. But we tend to complexify this situation. So I've had a journey of going from a person who did not think of themselves as an art collector to one that is very passionate. This is my very first piece. This is where I became an art collector. I'm in college at the University of Chicago studying chemistry. My roommate, which is indicative of who I am, my roommate was an art major. Now, usually that's not what happens in college. They usually pair you up by your majors. But I've always wanted to be around art, so my roommate was an art major. He came back from class with a lithograph that he had done in class. This is it. I looked at it, because he showed it to me, and I looked at it and I said, oh, this is interesting. What is a lithograph? Because I'm not taking art, never did take any art classes. But as a scientist, I knew that lithos means stone and graph means to write. So I said, you're writing with stone, but I don't know what you're doing. And he explained it. And then I did what I found 20, 30, 40 years later was the most important thing. I asked him if he was selling it. And he said, yeah, I'll sell it. And so we negotiated and came up with the astronomical sum of $10. And I still have this piece to the day. It is in my house right at the front door, so it is the beginning. This is the beginning of my art collecting. But I didn't realize it at the time that I was an art collector. I just thought I had bought something that I liked. It has gone on to be an absolute driving passion. I have over 1,300 pieces. I don't know how many pieces I have in my house. And I have them everywhere, including in the bathroom. And I have all different types of work, all different medias, and all different types of materials and so forth. And with, as what Bill was saying, is that I have a predominance of work by African American or African artists, but with about 90% of it. And my philosophy, as I have developed, was to only get work from living artists. So I'm not buying work from artists that have got a name, reputation, love their work, and so forth. But if I cannot affect their career, then I'm not buying that work. So, and in the process of reaching this point of becoming an art collector, I had to undo and unlearn some things. One was that you don't have to be rich. That's the first thing, is that we have bought into that lock, stock, and barrel that an art collector implies that you're rich. In fact, everybody approaches me that way, that if I say I'm an art collector, then they're just assuming I got a lot of money, and a lot of the artists think, oh, here's the ATM machine. You know, you just put the card in, out comes the money. The second thing that people think, and I had to overcome, was that you are a private individual, that you don't want to share what you have, and that the security is of the utmost importance for your collection. I do not subscribe to that. As I was in the introduction, that part of our mission is to share, is that we open our doors, we let people come in and see our art collections and to get the information out. The third thing that blocks us and blocked me for almost 20, 30 years was that we believe that if you say you are an art collector, you have to know something. Because we will quickly, at a drop of a hat, if somebody presents you with some art, you will say, well, I don't know anything about art. I'm like, what do you have to know? Why do we believe that you have to be academic? And I think people in this community have rebelled against that, and the artists have rebelled against it, that you have to know something about art, that you have to be encyclopedic. You don't. You have to do what I did in the very beginning. You see something and you like it. And that's what I attribute, and I thank you for this community, in that it is saying, I'm looking at something that people who are untrained or theoretically untrained, and I like it. And that's enough. That's really enough for all of us to do that, to actually create a very viable visual arts community. The fourth thing that I had to unlearn was that this is not about investment. It is about, in a sense of financial investment. That will come, but it is an actual investment in a culture, in a feeling about something that has importance to humans, not necessarily to the bank account. And so once I overcame that, then I was off to the races to acquiring work. And this is the kind of things that in my house. And one of the things that I've been moving in the circle of the intuitive, naive artist all my life, because I just go to see art. So when you were talking, I said, I went to the Cochran show. I saw that. I didn't think of it like that way. I was in Paris and I saw a show there and bought a piece from of an artist there, Jean Bergeon, outsider artist, but I wasn't thinking about it like that. I went to the National Vietnam War Memorial, and I saw Dr. Charles Smith's work, and I bought some of that. But I wasn't thinking about it as in that terms. I was looking at, I like that. That was all it was. So I've been doing this all along. In fact, when I was putting the slideshow together, I didn't go back and point out the pieces. I have lots of them that would qualify as intuitive art. But in this piece, right next to me, is the Derek Webster. And I didn't even think about it until putting the show together. There's a Derek Webster, one of his fancy ladies with her hands up. But I went to see him and went to his home, which is amazing. But I wasn't thinking of him as a naive artist. He's an artist here in Chicago. So this is sort of reflective of the kind of walls I have. And two of the pieces up at the top, the red ones, were by an artist that is self-taught. Just going back over it, I just looked at it and said, oh, wow, she's a self-taught artist. I have Shirley Hudson. I've been collecting her for hundreds of years. And I've just found out through the Black Folk Art Show that you had, the Post-Black Art, that she is considered one of the artists. Mr. Imagination was a friend of mine. I had his work. He asked me when he first got started for me to take some pictures of his work. Dr. Phil Pott, I used to see him on 63rd Street selling his canes all the time. So these are people that were in my community, but were not necessarily, I was not relating to them as Intuit artists. Now, this is how I actually got started. My father was a frustrated painter. He would have been truly a formally trained artist if we did not have rampant racism in the United States. In the Depression, he came out of high school with all kinds of national awards for art as a high school student, received a full scholarship offer from the Pittsburgh Institute of Fine Art. And a month later, after they sent him that letter, they sent him another letter saying, we can't let you in here because you're black. And so he never got to go to school. But this is the work that he was doing. The one on the right is a piece that he did in 1941. He graduated from high school in 1935. So this is 6 years after he graduated from high school, no formal training at all. The other one is the picture he did of our family in 1954. So this is the work that I grew up looking at all of my life. So I've always been in the environment of art. And now the question is he formally trained? Is he self-taught? Is he naive or so forth? It's a very formal piece. It's surrealism work. But this is what I've been seeing all my life. And as a result, I am an advocate for people to go out and collect what you like, and you will end up with a phenomenal collection, just as the rest of the people on the panel have done. And it is not necessarily that you have to focus on a particular type. Consciously, it can even come about when you are unconsciously acquiring work. After I put in the slides, I got the program, and I saw all these names, and I said, oh, wow. I have Derek Webster. I've got R. Keith Cheney in my collection. I've got Shirley Hudson, Mr. Imagination, Dr. Charles Smith. I have Della Wells' piece. I have Marvin Tate's piece. I have Sylvester Henderson. I have Travis, who's an outside artist, David Philpott. So it's interesting that I did not intend to do that, and yet I actually have a phenomenal outsider art collection. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Mike Noland, and I am an addict. So, anybody that's been to my house knows that our house is filled from floor to ceiling with every kind of art, from self-taught art to some of my friends' work. I don't really, I just like art, you know, I mean, I love art. The way I got started collecting self-taught art was in 1979, right before I moved to Columbus, Ohio to go to Ohio State for graduate school. Life magazine came out with a feature article on self-taught artists, and one of them was Elijah Pierce. And it clicked in my head that I was going to Columbus, and he was in Columbus. It had a picture of his barbershop, and so he was the first person I called before I even went to Columbus. I called him, and it was just a gut instinct thing. There was something about this work I saw in this magazine that really appealed to something in me, and it had to do with some of the things that the artists talked about, that they were making art because God had told them to, or because they had visions. But it was so different from me as being an artist who was trained. It was coming from a different spiritual place. So I felt like it was somehow something I had to explore. So I met Elijah Pierce. I don't know, how do I do the pointer? Is that the B? Which is the pointer? And that turns the pointer on? Is the pointer on? The laser pointer?
It's on the bottom.
Oh, is it the trigger pin? Oh, anyway, I don't know. I was going to try to do it. I can't do the laser pointer. Okay. Anyway, I guess it doesn't matter. This is my finger. But anyway, Elijah Pierce is that angel piece on the top left, and the portrait of Jimmy Carter and his sister Ruth. Martin Ramirez, William Hawkins. It's just all kind of a big mixture, actually. But as you can see in these photos, I have Carl Wortham, Dixon with Minnie Evans, Elijah Pierce, Fred Stonehouse. It's just there's no rhyme or reason to it. I don't have any, I don't categorize stuff, and I don't think of things that way, but I do try to place things that seem to relate to each other. I came to Chicago in 1984, and I had seen a catalog of Roger Brown's work, and it showed a picture of his house. And I saw that somehow in my own idiot savant method in Ohio, I had been traveling and meeting a lot of these artists, such as Howard Finster, S.L. Jones. I came up and met William Dawson before I moved to Chicago, Elijah Pierce, of course. So I was meeting these people, and what was important to me was this spiritual connection between me and these artists that seemed to be making art, or they were making art that had nothing to do with the art machinery, the contemporary art world, or the thing that a lot of people in graduate school were talking about, like being in a gallery, making it, all those kind of things. And here I was meeting these people that some of them didn't know they were artists. They had never called themselves artists, but yet they were making beautiful artwork, and they were artists. They just had never realized it. So when I moved to Chicago, I met Roger Brown, and we became good friends, and he became a mentor of mine of sorts and an early supporter of my work. But he also turned me on to, when I met him, I realized there was other people in the world like me, like collecting, and also having their houses full from floor to ceiling, just this kind of style of collecting. And then I met Ray Yoshida and, Jim Nutt and a lot of the other artists that also collect this stuff. So basically, when I picked out the slides, I didn't follow the rules, I'm pretty sure, Bill, did I? I don't think so. But I wanted to show you what I live with, sort of like an example of what my house is full of. Everything from anonymous puppet heads to Adolf Wolfleys to contemporary art also. Martin Ramirez is probably one of my favorite artists, and I've been fortunate enough to have some pieces of his. But one of the things I wanted to talk about is that I was really good friends with some artists from Ohio when I was first starting out, such as Popeye Rita, Stone Carver. I met William Hawkins before he became really well known through the Rico Maresca Gallery. I was in some group shows with him at a gallery called the Ohio Gallery that showed contemporary art and self-taught art. It may have been the first gallery to do it, except for Phyllis Kind, I think. But this was in Ohio, and Phyllis Kind was doing the same thing in New York and Chicago. But when I came to Chicago, I sort of felt like I came home or something. I met all these people that had like-minded ideas about collecting, and then through Roger, in the beginning, before Intuit had a name, I think it was called the Center for Outsider I don't remember. The Society, right. I have the poster somewhere from that first show that Clay Morrison and Aaron and I did. And I need to donate that sign to you guys because it's part of history. It's from the first show. We didn't even have a name yet then. But so over the years, I've continued to collect. But, you know, like Patrick was saying, I never had any money. I mean, my wife and I, she worked for the phone company. I'm an artist. We were always broke. But we would go to these artists, and they were kind enough to let us pay off, like, you know, at that time, $40 seemed to be like a common price of things. And it would be like, well, can we make 2 payments? You know, like we would have to pay $20 and maybe a few weeks later pay another $20. But they were always really kind about it. And now when you look at this collection, I mean, it didn't happen overnight. It took 38 years to build this collection. So I don't have a lot of money, as Patrick was saying. I mean, I'm not somebody that can just go in and just write a check for anything that I see. I've had to do trading with people. I've had to trade my own artwork, my own paintings for pieces. But somehow it doesn't take, it takes will, you know, or somehow through just sheer will, I've built this collection together, not from having a lot of money. One of the things that, this is a woman from Columbus who is not very well known, but her name was Mary Merle, and she was an early discovery of mine. And this is a piece of coal with bubble gum. The lips are made with bubble gum, and the eyes, the pearl eyes, are put on with bubble gum. And she used cosmetics. She didn't know about paint, so she painted with cosmetics. So this piece of coal, which to me looks like a piece of contemporary art, or, you know, I mean, it could have been anything. But I live with a lot of her work, and she is, to me, one of the greatest artists that nobody's really ever heard of. She was an African-American artist who was also friends with William Hawkins, who I knew really well. But just this whole concept of, like, she didn't have a clue of how to apply things, so she chewed up bubble gum and used the bubble gum to put the things on. And then she didn't really know about paint, so she actually used cosmetics and lipstick and things like that to decorate them. This was a guy who was one of my best friends, is Popeye Reed, a self-taught stone carver from Ohio who died in 1984. On the left is a sphinx, what he called a sphinx. To me, I just think it's one of the most beautiful stone carvings I've ever seen. And on the right is one of he had these 5 pieces that he called his 5 masterpieces, and this is Apollo, one of the 5 masterpieces. I wanted to show, William Dawson is on the left in this picture, but the case that the William Dawsons are in is a bowling pin covered case that was made for bowling trophies. So it's like a piece of tramp art, but it's a gigantic case. And when I bought it at an antique show, I didn't even know if it would fit in my house. I mean, we barely got it up the stairs. I just bought it because I thought, what a crazy thing. And it's got, you know, every different size of bowling pins. But then, you know, Dawson made some figures from bowling pins, and I just thought, well, Dawson would look good in there. And then on the right is one of my latest acquisitions, an artist who is, you know, one of my favorite artists, but I never dreamed that someday I would be able to have an Adolf Wolfley. But I've been blessed, and now I'm able to live with one. And for me, that's a big accomplishment. Because I feel like we're just caretakers of this work. That's something I think Cleo was talking about a while ago, or maybe Patrick. But, you know, I always open my collection up for tour groups. I feel like it's my duty as a collector to share and educate people. And one of my big things right now is I'm trying to figure out how to get more young people involved with our group, but also with just collecting, you know, just the idea of collecting, the idea that you don't have to have a lot of money, like Patrick was saying. You can go to flea markets, you can collect antique buttons, I mean, it doesn't have to be, you know, what I collect, it can be whatever you collect. This is an Elijah Pierce this piece hung over his barbershop door, and I just recently traded a Civil War cane to the Columbus Museum of Art to get this. This took me like 3 years of you know, whatever sheer craziness to get this. This is a discovery from an artist that we don't know his name, but he was from Dixon, Illinois, and his work, this top left figure is like some kind of winged shaman monster figure. And it has a noose around its neck, and it hangs from the noose. And then it has these sort of simplified figures riding deer and horses. I mean, there's a whole bunch of them. This is just an example. But then on the bottom left, there are these sort of like Kachina-like spacemen. And some of them had tape on them with writing. And I think the writing was, they were supposed to be portraits of individual people, and maybe that he knew. And they seem to have a magical spiritual quality about them, but I don't really understand what their function was. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank all of you. These were great. This was fabulous. Give me the. Let me get the clicker. I did just in case someone asked. Well, I put Mike last because he's a hard. Well, actually, between Patrick and Mike, in terms of density, they're hard acts to follow. And I don't have anything like that kind of density, but anymore. So just quickly, I mean, my collecting started with bottle cap figures, although these weren't, or these I bought much later, and there's some baskets there that you might be able to see as well. And just coincidentally, my most recent purchase is the portrait of Bill Clinton, which I acquired at the Intuit Gala auction just last month, I think. And they're sitting on a piece by art collector and artist named Dan Pohl, who those of you who know Dan on Facebook are familiar with him. If you are not friends with Dan Pohl, P-O-H-L on Facebook, you should be. Because Dan he posts several times a day just amazing pieces of art that he has, images of art that he has been trolling on the internet for years and collecting. Dan is a remarkable collector, but he made that piece of furniture, which is actually an early piece of his furniture. I have a few others. These are just some shots of pieces in the collection. The piece on the right is a carnival figure from an antique mall in somewhere south of Joliet, and then a bunch of carvings, a couple of George Williams. I did not buy from the artist. When I went to George Williams' house, he lived in I think he lived near Vicksburg, Mississippi, and he basically said, "Well, I have a Statue of Liberty drying out back," and that was it. And I didn't really love his statues of Liberty, so I didn't. I just said hi and moved on. Anyways, just a few more pictures. There's a black and white Lee Goede, which is interested me because it was black and white, above a self-portrait by Messina Barton, who was a Chicago modernist from the 20th century. I quite like Messina Barton, and I tend to mix contemporary art with self-taught art. The contemporary art is mostly out of my affordability range, but Barton's work remains pretty affordable. And miscellaneous pieces. On the right side, there's a couple of Chris Hipkiss drawings, the little tiny ones, a little tiny von Brunschenheim photo. And then underneath that, I mean, you can't really see them in these images. There's a 40,000 Murphy collage. That's a David Sisko lampshade that was a premium at an Intuit Gala when we did a lampshade theme for many years ago, and I got to bring home an original David Sisko. This was my first piece of art that I ever bought. It says "Spectacular Display in Night Sky." It was from the Catholic Social Services thrift store in Santa Barbara, California. I think I bought it around 1982. It shows a missile exploding above Vandenberg Air Force Base in Lompoc, California. But an interesting story about why I bought this piece. I was collecting just stuff. I mean, mostly kitsch objects, toys, salt and pepper shakers. I spent a lot of time at thrift stores, buying a lot of records. And I had a friend who was an art student at Cal Arts, and a good high school friend, and he told me, because we all went to, my group of friends all spent a lot of time in thrift stores, and he said, I have this friend at Cal Arts, from Cal Arts, who's finding the most amazing stuff at thrift stores. He's buying these paintings, and he's found this group of paintings of robots doing things like playing football. And I thought, because I collected robots, among other things, I thought, boy, I got to start looking for art when I go to thrift stores. And the first thrift store visit after that, I found this painting. It took me years to find anything as interesting as this painting. But of course, my friend's friend was Jim Shaw, who Intuit's, who wrote, well, and one of Intuit's, I guess it would be the first or the second Intuit-sponsored show was the thrift store painting show of Jim Shaw. And I never met Jim, but indirectly, Jim was how I started collecting art, because it never occurred to me to look for paintings. It was sort of, to Patric's point, I thought collecting art was totally out of reach. I mean, it was not something I ever thought about. But when I found out you could buy it at thrift stores, changed my life. We had the thing about discovery. So this is the top of a box by Stanley Schwartz, the metal worker, who I stumbled across at the Casablanca Flea Market on Cicero Avenue, where he wasn't selling that piece, but he was selling boxes and crosses for like $5. I think the crosses were $2.50 each, and the boxes were $5. And then I spent a lot of time with Stanley over the years after that, and acquired many, many, many pieces from him. The other discovery I was going to share is this is an artist named Joe Markovicius, who is from the south side of Chicago. Mostly worked in pastels. Some of you might recognize this as Aladdin's Castle at Riverview. He generally drew city scenes, often of buildings that were torn down very shortly after he drew them. He had a taste for doomed architecture, and had a real talent for the sky, as you can see here. Recently died. He passed away about 2 months ago or 3 months ago, but was an amazing artist of really great talent, great detail. And then this is sort of in the discovery department. This is the other artist that I essentially found, which is Joe 40,000 Murphy, lived in Bridgeport. Phil, I talked about him yesterday, so I don't need to go through his biography again. But this is a pretty large piece. This is a piece from that room in the attic I alluded to, that was covered with cheesecake photos, which if you can kind of see. That is Joe with Sonia Henney. Those of us of a certain age at least know who Sonia Henney was. She was a skater who became a Hollywood movie star in the 1940s. Was very beloved by Joe. He has many, many images of Sonia Henney that in his environment, and I think that was it. One question I wanted. Well, two things. One other thing about myself, as long as you asked. Well, because one of the questions I had, and I'll answer for myself, and then I'll throw it out, is someone who had a real influence on you as a collector, like who had the greatest influence on you as a collector? And other than Jim Shaw, I had two people I would mention. One, and Mike probably doesn't remember this, but I remember when I was first starting to collect this kind of work, I was party to a conversation with Mike, where Mike, and I'm pretty sure it was you, and I won't name the artist, but Mike kind of poo-pooed an artist that was like well known and was getting well known, and I think a lot of people liked, and it kind of opened my eyes that you don't actually have to like everything. Which was just interesting. And the conversation was with the other person who had a huge influence on my collecting of this kind of art, which was that Dan Pohl, who his initial influence on me was indirect because he had built a fine collection with a then girlfriend. When they broke up, they split the collection, and I actually saw Dan's collection at the ex-girlfriend's house. And it was the first collection of this type that I ever saw. And my jaw dropped. I mean, I just couldn't believe the kind of stuff that she had, and that she could even have it. It was so eye-opening to me. And then over the years, after that, I finally met Dan, and Dan had a huge influence on me, and a fair amount of work that I own was work I purchased from Dan, including there's a Dawson head in the Chicago Calling Show that belongs to me, but it did belong to Dan first. So in multiple ways, Dan just had an enormous influence on my collecting. But let me throw the question to the panel. If there's anyone, I mean, you don't all have to answer if you don't want, but anyone who had a big influence on you as a collector, any particular person, or event. I mean, we know besides the Corcoran show, which had an influence on everyone, and me, it was by reading the catalog. I never saw the show, but anyone want to speak to that? Yeah.
I had a job when I first got out of graduate school moving art around the country, and I was spending a couple of weeks in New York City, and it just so happened that I had become more aware of, some of the, I guess, heroes or the gods of collecting of this type of work, and one of them was Bert Hemphill. And it just so happened that we went to his apartment and we were delivering some pieces to him. And I became very, pretty friendly with Bert, and over the years he was very supportive, and he gave me some advice about one thing that he would do was that he would bring home a piece and put it on his dining room table and then look at it for a while and see if it held up to the rest of his collection. And that's something I still do today. My dining room table has several things on it right now that I'm still trying to figure out, is this good enough? Does it really work with the collection? And also, it always takes a while to figure out where to place something. But I would say him, and then like I said, Roger Brown, Dan Pohl, Clay Morrison was a big friend early. So that was who I was going to mention.
Anyone else want to speak to that?
I think I would agree maybe that the Herbert Hemphill books, I mean, the beginning of publications of that type that showed these collections, and even just being associated with Intuit, and in Chicago, the fact that we had Ann Nathan and Phyllis Kine and Carl Hammer in the 80s showing this kind of work along with other collections, and then through them, we formed this organization, and being able to visit other people's collections, I think influenced all of us.
I would totally agree. You can hear me anyway. Yeah. But I would say my sheroes are, seeing how other people put the art up, and certainly Susanna was one of those people. If you had a chance to go on a tour yesterday to see how people installed their art, had a major influence on the possibilities, I guess. Yeah, I grew up in a house that had one painting, and it was a giant, one of those scenes that looks, of the mountains, that had the light and all this kind of stuff. Huge print of something that was over the couch. And that was the only art that I knew at that time, growing up, to have that one piece in the house. And so the idea that you could have many pieces of art, and it, like you said, I started cutting stuff out of magazines and things like that. It just knowing other collectors has its own inspiration, is its own inspiration.
Thank you. Well, I have two major influences on me, one direct and one indirect. The direct one is the artist, Jonathan Green, and his partner, Richard Weedman. I was basically introduced through them to the actual act of art collecting, because they are art. He's an artist, a very famous and renowned artist. But when I went to his home and saw the collection and how passionate they were about collecting, and collecting all different types, because they even have the Intuit, an outsider art in their collection, and their way that they spoke about it, and they were also recognizing in me that I was an art collector. That had the greatest effect directly. Indirectly, I would say it's Margaret Burroughs, Dr. Margaret Burroughs, who was an indirect influence on me as an art collector, because as a young person, maybe 13, 14, 15 years old, I went to her house when she had the museum in her house, the Ebony Museum, and it just blew me away to see that someone could have this in their home and be very open about the act of sharing it, because she would say, "Oh, baby, just go downstairs and look at the art." And that just still stuck with me, that people could collect and be open to that.
The one major person I forgot to mention is Ruth Horwich. Ruth used to have, I used to go down there with Roger Brown, and we would sit around and have cocktails, and you'd be looking up, and there were Alexander Calders all around, floating around and on the table, and Magritte paintings by a Popeye Reed stone carving. Luckily enough, I had 3 paintings in her collection, which to me, that was like the ultimate, stamp of approval or something. So I just wanted to mention Ruth because she's very important.
So let me turn the question around. If you have a good answer, feel free. Is cases where felt like you had an impact on an artist as a collector, that you actually somehow affected the artist, or for better or worse, you never know. Does anyone have a encounter like that?
I had one with Mike Noland. No, this is, I remember being in Mike's studio once when he had a painting in process. And I said, gee, I love that painting. I'd love to have a chance to buy it when you finish it. Well, months went by, and later Mike told me I sort of stopped him in his tracks for a while because he was afraid to finish it, that I might not like it or something. I love it. It's a major piece of my collection.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I really changed the painting that much. It was just
You didn't change it, I'm sure.
No, but it was just the idea that, usually it's very unusual to have people come in your studio when you're working on a painting and they say, hey, I want to buy that no matter what, or whatever. And then you just go like, well, you feel a little bit like, paralyzed or something, or I did. And then she has the painting now, so. Anyway.
For me, it was Mr. Imagination. I really liked going to his apartment on Belmont. Whatever street that is, Clark. And it was first of all, he was a major collector. He had tons of stuff in his apartment. And at that time, he was sleeping on the couch. His dog was sleeping there with him, and his brother had taken over the bedroom. But going to his apartment, I was able to see what Carl wasn't taking, because, the dealer was curating. So the stuff that stayed in the house that Mr. I kept or sold out the back door was quite different. So one of the pieces I was buying for Bob, he was making these things called Big Mamas, and he was. I don't know what he was using, because the paintbrush faces were all done with plastic wood, a terrible toxic thing that he was using to make the faces with, but. I don't know if this was plaster. I don't know what the thing was to make these sculptures. This Big Mama was about this tall, and he had made a dress, a strapless dress out of pounding bottle caps into making it like a giant sequin dress. And then he collaborated with his brother for this one, and his brother had made a little purse out of cigarette wrappers to hang over the shoulder, so it was a combined piece. And it was, and I haven't seen many of those pieces. And I know that, he would pile the stuff up so high that one time the stuff fell down and broke a lot of stuff. But, having him work with his brother to finish off that piece, but adding that thing was really nice for me.
It's a weird coincidence, but the artist that I think maybe I had the most influence and maybe had an influence on me is Dr. Charles Smith, who happens to be here today. I was living in Aurora, and one of my neighbors came in my house and saw my collection, and they said, when we were in high school, we used to go drive by this guy's house late at night, and we always thought it was kind of haunted or weird. There was all these sculptures in the yard. We didn't know what it was. And I said, what? There's a guy and they said, yeah, his work looks a lot like what you collect. And I said, that's crazy. So it was like 1 o'clock in the morning. We drove over there, and I saw his place in the dark, and I went, yeah, in the moonlight, or it was very dark, and I said, wow. So the next day, the first thing I did was took my kids to school, and I went over to his house and left him a note saying, please call me, we got to get in touch, you know, and then he called me, and we became really good friends. But I was sort of protective of him in a way at first because I'd seen artists be exploited by galleries and things. I didn't know how to handle it. So eventually I told Jim Zanzi and Lisa Stone and some other people, and Dave Cargill also, but I was sort of protective of him because he was the first pure person I'd ever met that had never been touched by any of this art world stuff. And he was making this stuff, and it had a profound effect on me. And then, of course, getting to know him, we became great friends, you know. So that's, I don't know, he could tell you if I did have an influence or not. I'm not sure, but I think so.
I just wanted to say that there's an artist, not an outsider artist, but Julian Williams, who I have had a dramatic effect upon his career. I've been following him for now, maybe 30, 40 years. But when I first came across him, he had a piece of work for sale, and when he told me the price, I said, that's too low. And that's, you know, it really was very, very low. And I said, no, this is worth more than that. And starting with that relationship, I've always been around and always encouraged him to be creative, to try different things, even to reject all that he learned in graduate school, just go back to where you were. And he still, to this day, is very appreciative that as a collector, I have been interacting with him and supporting his career and the way he approaches things.
So I think we have time for Lisa. You have the mic. You have 2 minutes.
Oh, I won't use that much time. Since we're in the Day of the Dead zone or sphere, I'd just like to remember Clay Morrison, who I think had a really open, generous way of looking at and thinking about and acquiring art, and he had a major impact on me early on. He also curated the first Day of the Dead show in Chicago, even though he was not Latinx. That's it.
By the way, similar to Dan Pohl, Clay had an impact on me before I ever met him or knew who he was, because in the 80s he had a show of Japanese robot toys, which I happened to be collecting at the time, and I saw at the University of Connecticut. I had no idea, I never heard of this guy, but later on I realized that's who curated the show, which was, again, important to me because that was one of my main collecting interests at the time. So these weird connections of influence on me before I meet the people.
I don't know if he was a founder, but a very early member of curator.
I think we have time for one or two questions. Yes.
I'm curious, do you guys have any specific ways of archiving your work, if any? And then also, do you have plans for the future of your collection?
Yeah, you have plans for archiving the work? Yeah, and Mike leaned over to me and said, I have no idea how much is in my collection, but, you know, Patric clearly has a sense of what's in his collection.
Right. Sense of what's in there. I know that it's a lot. I am in the process of archiving them. I'm documenting all the pieces. It's an ordeal because I didn't plan to do that. Photographing everything, and now I have an intern that she's coming in and we add all the information. I have created a trust because I do want it to transfer and over without being dispersed and so forth. My intentions are to keep the artwork all intact and on the condo and to do something very similar to what everybody comes and says, have you seen Roger Brown? I say, yeah, I've seen Roger Brown. I'd like to do something very similar to that. So I've created a trust, and that's my intention is to pass it on to my organization to keep all of that intact.
Hi, I'm Hector from the Arts of Life. I work with Lexi and Vincent here today. And I was wondering if with your practices of like collecting art or doing art, have you guys gotten any influences like going around the world? Because I see in my estimation that it seems like some of this is like Egyptian art or African art in some of your, collectings. Do you guys get influences like going around the world or seeing stuff around the world to collect this type of art?
Well, going around the world became secondary to the collecting because I wasn't able to go around, to visit other places probably until I was almost retired. But the African art that I would see in museums and even the art that started being produced to sell to the market, especially in New York, you go down the street and they have these tables set up and they're selling things that are purportedly African art. I liked seeing that work, and I liked when I could have pieces. So the mask that I have in my house, I actually bought from Ann Nathan, and I don't think she went to Africa to buy them either.
I want to go back to your question, but before I do, the other thing is the world is coming to us. The Outsider Art Fair now in New York, you can see art from Japan, art from New Zealand, art from Europe. So it's because of our global hair signs, African hair signs. We actually, one of our very early shows was African hair signs. So we can be exposed to this kind of art without travel, but I'm sure that most of us, when we do travel, we're looking at flea markets also.
Yeah.
But to go back to your question, and maybe, not that it's a pitch, but I intend for the art in my collection, you may not know, but Intuit has a permanent collection, and I'm going to be very happy to know that the art that I've collected will stay in Chicago in the Intuit permanent collection. A few pieces maybe in Sheboygan also at the John Michael Kohler Art Center. But as Mike said, we're just caretakers of this art, and hopefully we'll pass it on so that other people will be able to enjoy it as much as we have in our own homes.
In regards to your question about travel, I've traveled, but not with the intent to acquire art, but not ever stopping to look. I will look and will acquire things, but it will not. That wasn't the intent to do that. So I have pieces from travels from all through Africa and Europe and so forth in the Caribbean, but that was not the intent.
I have collected a few things. I've been to Germany and Amsterdam a lot in the last few years, and I discovered a place called Die Slumper, I think, Slumper. But it's sort of like the Guggen Museum. And I was at the Hamburg Flea Market with Fred Stonehouse, and we just were walking around, and I saw this thing in the window that looked like Art Brut, and I thought, what? How could that be at this flea market? So I went over to the door, and it's a place where they have people that maybe have disabilities or whatever. But there's one of their artists is a big star. I didn't know it at the time, but he's sort of like the Walla of Guggen, but his name is I can't even think of his name. But the thing is, I never look for this stuff when I'm traveling. But what's that? Yeah, Uwe Bender, that's him. And I've become really good friends with him. I've seen him 3 times. But what I'm saying is, like, I could be in a flea market in Berlin and see something. I mean, I don't go looking for it, but I always seem to find it. Or it finds me, yeah.